So good afternoon, everyone. Really glad you could all be here today for our third Conservation Connector. I'm Cynthia Canner. If I haven't met some of you, I'm the Executive Director of Prairie State Conservation Coalition, and just really happy to see everyone here today for this really interesting and compelling conversation about nature-based solutions and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And we're going to have an overview of what that means and how that connects with all of you who are working in the conservation land trust community and for forest preserves, conservation districts, and all the other conservation organizations out there who are interested in funding that's available, how to get it, where to put it, how to use it. So we're looking forward to this conversation very much. And we are here with our speakers. And Becca Truman is the State Revolving Fund Watershed Coordinator, Mississippi River Basin. Becca brings nearly a decade of experience in natural resources planning and management to quantified ventures. She's thrilled to connect with and support the stakeholders of the Mississippi River Basin. And as you'll notice, her background is beautiful Mississippi River. And then Sean O'Rourke is Director for Quantified Ventures. Sean has more than 15 years of climate leadership in the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors. He's passionate about working with municipalities, counties, and states to accelerate implementation of nature-based solutions to solve multiple problems all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this over to Sean for your intro, and we look forward to your remarks, and we will take questions after the talks are completed, either by raising your hand, or if you prefer chat, we can do that too and keep it flexible. Thank you all. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cynthia, and great to see so many familiar names and faces on the screen today. Becca and I are thrilled to join you and talk about how we can accelerate nature-based solution work and accelerate access to unprecedented amount of federal capital. The time is now to be accessing this funding, thinking forward-looking about how we align project pipeline and potential with these sources of funding that are now available. And that's really what we're looking to do nationally. So I oversee our National Watershed Coordinator Initiative, which is the Chicagoland area. And we're thrilled to have Rebecca Judd on the line here as one of our generous funders for our work in the Chicagoland area. And I function as the Watershed Coordinator for Chicagoland. We have the Mississippi River region, which Becca leads. And we have the state of Texas and then the Colorado River Basin, where we're completely focused on trying to see how we unlock new capital, new sources of capital for nature-based solution projects around the country. We have a particular focus on the state revolving funds, which Becca will talk about quite a bit here today, which we think are a generational opportunity for how we finance nature-based solution at scale as water infrastructure, and making sure that these historically non-traditional projects that we're all doing in the land trust and land conservation space actually become water infrastructure projects and really can untap new capital. A little bit of background about Quantified Ventures, because that might be brand new to many of you on the line today. We're an organization of problem solvers that works at the intersection of health as well as environment and climate resilience issues. We work to come up with outcomes to big, messy, sticky problems like how do we accelerate nature-based solution work? And we come at that through outcomes-based approaches with policy as well as financing outcomes and approaches. Our Watershed Coordinator initiative that Becca will talk about is directly in line with that. And we're looking to do a number of these items about pipeline building, looking for new resources to connect your projects with state and federal sources of funding, remove some of those key challenges of like, how do I write the application or where to even find money for my project? We're here to help. We're funded to do so. And we really want to stress test by removing the hypothetical of projects, which, yeah, we could use nature-based solution money for that, but actually put projects through the system to really figure out where the challenges are. And Becca will hit on a lot of that today. So I'll pause there, but thrilled to join you all. Looking forward to the conversation afterwards. And thanks everyone for the time. Turn it over to Becca.
Thanks, Sean. Let me get my screen up here. Oh, I should have tested this. It says host disabled. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Let's see. We had too much fun chatting when we got on
I
early.
know. Thinking we were like catching up, not thinking about the actual logistics of what we were doing. All right, perfect. Here we go. Awesome. And just let me know if you're having trouble seeing my screen or hearing me at any point. I'm going to jump in. Thanks for that introduction and overview, Sean. And thanks a bunch, Cynthia, for organizing this. We were thrilled to meet you a couple of months ago via introductions with Bennett, and excited to kind of get this conversation started. So I'm going to be talking, as has been said, about nature-based solutions and state revolving funds, specifically the Clean Water State Revolving Funds. Going to do some overviews, some deeper dives. I have a lot I want to talk about. If at any point, I know a lot of this is going to be relatively new, if not totally new. So if at any point there's something that isn't clear, or topics that would be helpful for you to understand better, feel free to put that in the chat or make a note and we can talk about that later. We really want this to be as helpful to you as possible. And it's really helpful on my end to know where I can be providing better information that suits your needs. So I know we all have a lot of webinars we attend and informational sessions. So a reminder of the goals for today, the abstract and what I'm talking about. So we have, as Sean described, unprecedented funding right now for climate and environment, and it really encourages collaboration, inclusivity, and innovative outcomes. One of these financial pathways to those who want to install nature-based solutions is the State Revolving Fund. Of course, there are many others. And one of the reasons we're really focused on State Revolving Fund, or SRF, as I'm going to describe them from now on, is this huge injection through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the bill, that really puts a ton of money, $44 billion to be exact, over the next 5 years. And these funds truly have the potential to be the largest impact investor on the planet. As we've described, and we'll kind of keep explaining kind of what we're focused on. We're really focused on supporting communities directly with accessing these funds, getting their projects to the ground, and specifically SRF, but more broadly, just all the funding and financing available. We know there's a lot. We know it's a challenge. Our jobs are literally to be in the space, figuring out where we can be the most helpful. And I'm really excited to connect with the land conservation and land trust community here in Illinois. So quick overview, who is Quantified Ventures, get us the stage set, nature-based solutions, funding, and then diving deeper into what state revolving funds are, how they work, the history of their use, as well as really the potential for nature-based solution projects to be funded through the SRF, and some thoughts so far on making your case to getting access to the SRF. So overall, really just meant to get the wheels spinning and start seeing state revolving funds as a real option for your community. Before I talk about QV, I know Sean provided a really nice overview as well. Just a little bit about myself. So I started with Quantified Ventures back in April. I know before the recording started, people were talking about some different activities. So previous to this, I worked directly as a watershed coordinator locally in Kentucky. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. So I would come really from the 319 watershed plan background. I was working there for about 4.5 years. I've also served on my local soil and water conservation district board as a board supervisor. I'm involved locally with Watershed Watch and helping people connect to their streams and learn how to monitor. Somebody mentioned native plants. I'm a huge native plants advocate. Really have a big passion for that, and I will talk about native plants anytime. I think a lot of what we're talking about, one of the key features is really one plant from another, and that's a huge shift that we need all around in how we think about our land. So I'll stop there, or you'll get me going on native plants longer. But as Sean said, Quantified Ventures, so we are a certified B Corp. We really focus on working with kind of pioneering organizations to design, capitalize, and scale investable solutions focused on both people and the planet. And then we've got our watershed coordinator team, which Sean and myself are part of, in addition to our other colleagues, and overall that umbrella focus of helping communities obtain funding and financing for nature-based solutions projects. Putting a map to where we're currently working within our watershed work. So I've got these 11 hypoxia task force states in the Mississippi. We've got Sean, who's up in the Chicago metro area. So Illinois actually has 2 watershed coordinators. And then we've got somebody in the state of Texas and somebody in the Colorado River Basin. So all working in our respective regions to support communities in this work. These 4 kind of main buckets of what we're here to help with. So bringing that financial support and expertise, project prioritization, partnership development, and then long-term project support and funding. Okay, nature-based solutions. So I think at this point we're kind of all on the same page with nature-based solutions, but I also don't want to make too many assumptions with how words are used in different places. So we're focused on nature-based solutions because they really kind of are a one-stop shop encompassing all of these various kind of large societal needs, both from environment to human well-being to biodiversity, focusing on practice that really mimic natural processes in nature, sort of supporting and recreating these holistic ecosystem services, having mutual beneficial practices, and then ultimately making sure that these practices are sustainable long term. So clarifying here, I think it's important to show, nature-based solutions come in many different forms, right? So we've got more of the large scale, the natural infrastructure, which I imagine a lot of people on this call are most passionate about and have directly worked with. So natural infrastructure, when it comes to nature-based solutions, we're really talking about larger scale, larger landscape practices where if once they're established, you might not even know anybody ever, stuck a shovel or any equipment in that area to create the space. Larger scale sites. Then we have our smaller scale, which are the low impact development practices, such as a rain garden. And so when it comes to nature-based solutions, I really like to think of them as long as you put the right plants in the right place, you're going to create room for all of these benefits for clean water, air, habitat, and then all of our co-benefits as well. So again, we know there's a whole list of benefits we get from nature-based solutions. I find that it's really important to have, think about both the right benefits and the co-benefits you want to talk about. And that really depends on who you're talking to, what the purpose is. So rather than leading with nature-based solutions, sometimes it's more important to lead with, what are the priorities that a community or a group has. And so, for example, watershed priorities are really focused on pollution, riparian habitat, as well as floodplain connectivity. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think land trusts are really focused on land conservation, protection, and habitat connectivity. A lot of grants nowadays are really focused on environmental justice and community resilience. And then you've got your local government priorities, which I'm going to get to more later, but local governments, they are fiscally responsible for our budget, for the local budget. So thinking about how do you reduce user rates or not have them go way up, public health and tourism and things like that. And then community organizations, which maybe are concerned about green spaces or educational opportunities. So it all ties to nature-based solutions, but we just want to talk about it in a way that we're really getting at the priorities for who we're talking to or what money that we're trying to obtain. So money, I'm going to very briefly talk about funding as a whole and then get into state revolving funds. So as you may know, there's really been this national level prioritization of nature-based solutions at the White House level. If you haven't seen these documents, I'd encourage you to just search, White House and nature-based solutions, and they should come up pretty close to the top of your search. So the Biden administration is really putting priority to nature-based solutions, even if it's not always obvious to a lot of people. But a lot of the money, the bipartisan infrastructure law funds, it's really leaves the door open for how those notice of funding opportunities are written because they want to encourage nature-based solutions. And beyond that, having this roadmap be created has really done a thorough job of explaining like where we are and where we need to go and what help we need to get there. And of course, there's billions and billions of dollars available to do that. And so lots of agencies, this is definitely not a comprehensive list, but just making that statement that there is a lot of money out there. It's going to be coming out over the next few years. We're keeping an eye on it. We want to help people access it if they need that help. And I encourage others to be aware of that as well. Okay, going a little bit deeper, going to get you to state revolving funds and where this all connects in. So I'm talking specifically about the bipartisan infrastructure law. That's one of the two main pieces of legislation that's really like kickstarting this whole change in federal funding focused on nature-based solutions and climate. We also have the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not talking about that specifically, but just kind of clarifying there's those two big ones, okay? So bipartisan infrastructure law, this graphic kind of gives a little bit of a nice overview of the breakdown of where this money is being allocated to. So we're in T's and B's now. Okay, so $1.2 trillion, and then that's being split kind of within these different priorities. You can look at these different ways, but I like this graphic because it really focuses on priorities. One thing, though, that is really important to clarify that this graphic doesn't do is that there are places I don't want to say definitely, but I think at least most of these categories where you can tie nature-based solutions in. So even though you've got this, 47.2 billion for resiliency, that's not the only place you can fund nature-based solutions. So looking at all of these, and just because it doesn't seem like, your land conservation practices are a good fit, don't let that deter you. It's really important to still look and see what's actually eligible within these. So one of the reasons that we're really focused on state revolving funds is because amongst these funds that the bill has allocated, we see that water infrastructure is a huge piece of this. So we've got $55 billion going to water infrastructure over the next few years. We see to the right, we've got sort of a pie chart of what that's actually going to. So these acronyms here, so DWSRF, that's the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. CWSRF, that's the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I'm going to clarify these a little bit later. So these are the two, there's only kind of two actual programs from federal government, right? So there's two state revolving fund programs. These are them, and 44 billion out of the $55 billion is going to these programs through the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's a lot of money. I'm going to talk specifically about what this money is for from our perspective, but just making sure a lot of people don't realize this is the money that is also going towards emerging contaminants such as PFAS and lead service line replacement, as well as drinking wastewater and other clean water priorities. Okay, if you're still with me, let's go a little bit deeper here into state revolving funds. So since starting this position, I started in April. I know Sean started a few months before that. We've got a couple, we all started around like late winter, springtime. We've really been focused on figuring out where barriers are, where inroads are to support getting state revolving funds connected to nature-based solution projects. And so we've been talking to a lot of people. We've been kind of investigating what makes sense state by state and where we're working at. And our goals are ultimately to actually get these nature-based solution projects applied for through state revolving funds and approved for funding, ranked high enough to be approved. So we're trying to figure out between what's possible and what's theoretical, really, as Sean nicely likes to put it, like stress testing this is our big goal. So we're working on kind of creating that pipeline of projects for nature-based solution, natural infrastructure, providing direct technical support. We can talk about your projects. We can help you figure out if it's eligible. We can talk about how you're going to repay it because it is a loan, which is scary, I know. We can go all the way up to the state level. Sometimes it's really confusing what's actually eligible, all those logistics. We're talking at the state level, talking about projects specifically to make sure that we're on the same page and projects are actually eligible before we go too far down this process. So really providing as much hands-on support and technical support as we can and as is needed. So what we're hearing so far, this is kind of a high-level overview. So like I said, we're talking to the state level administrators of these programs, decision makers. they're really needing to see that pipeline of projects, needing to see that, yes, there are nature-based solution projects on the ground that need funding and are a priority because they don't see that from where they're sitting, understandably. But then at the ground level, those with nature-based solution projects need to understand how state revolving funds work. So there's a lot of chicken and egg scenario going there. The actual eligible borrowers, which is typically the utilities or those actually applying for and receiving these funds, they need help understanding nature-based solutions. Typically, the contractors they hire don't have experience with designing or installing green infrastructure. We got to bring those in. Thinking about cost analysis, can we prove out? We know this gets proved out again and again, but we really need to bring this to local level of showing that cost analysis, and then how do these projects actually get implemented and maintained. And then the big one here, realizing we're really kind of on the forefront of all this, but understandably, everybody wants to see examples. We don't always have them yet. So we're really at this new space where we're hoping to get to those examples. So just being aware that there are examples out there. There might not be an example for exactly what you want to do or in your state. So the bipartisan infrastructure law offers many financing pathways to nature-based solutions. So again, we're looking at all of them. I encourage others to look at all of them as well. But I still think it's really important that we all have a general awareness and even start to stress test our projects with the state revolving fund in our state, so Illinois in this case. Beyond the bill, state revolving funds have been around for a long time. They're going to be around for a long time. And ultimately, they're the largest source of federal funding for water infrastructure we've had. We have, again, reiterating that big amount of funding, $44 billion over the next few years. Big piece here, 49% of it has to be forgivable. So we can kind of equate that to free money, either through a reduced loan rate, kind of chopped off the top, or as a grant. They can decide how they want to allocate their forgivable money, also called subsidy. And as a whole, in terms of the available financing mechanisms that we have for nature-based solutions, SRFs really have the potential to be the largest investor mechanism in the world for nature-based solutions. Very high level overview of how money actually moves. So similar to other grant programs, the state revolving fund, it gets allocated yearly through the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, via the Clean Water Act. So there's yearly allocations to the state. States are required to provide a 20% match. States are managing these loan programs. They're managing the applications. They're managing their ranking. They're generating the loans. And then the repayment from the borrower comes back. It all gets revolved and it all happens year to year. And then every year there's additional money per the federal government that gets allocated back in. Really just highlighting the huge amount of money that we're getting through the bill. So the Clean Water and Drinking Water Fund programs, they started in different years. The Clean Water was in the late 80s, Drinking Water was in the late 90s. But since these funds were created through EPA, there's been about $92 billion allocated through the federal government budget. With the bill, we've got $44 billion over 5 years, and that doesn't even include the yearly allocation. Just a lot of money that's coming to these programs. So talking more specifically about the purpose of state revolving funds, these were created to be low interest loans. So it's going to be lower than you'd get if you walked into a bank and got a market rate. I think I just looked, in the highest rate that Illinois currently has is 1.8%, and then they've got different categories for other subsidies based on the project, but lower than you would get with the market. The revolving piece is really huge here because they provide a sustainable source of funding. You're good at having the loan, allows us to be a revolving system. I know we all love grants. I love grants, but once that money is gone, it's gone. This allows that long-term ability to have a sustainable source of funding, which also allows for longer-term project planning. We're talking about 20 to 30-year loans instead of maybe a 2-year grant. So we're thinking big projects, long term. In general, so this is where we get into what's possible, right? So in general, when these programs were established, let me say grants, when these programs were established by the EPA, their overarching purpose was to create a sustainable funding mechanism for safe, healthy, equitable, and affordable water systems. So what ties everything that gets funded via the state revolving fund together is water quality. As long as there is a water quality piece, then that project is eligible via the state revolving fund. I mentioned there's the 2 programs. I'm not too worried about drinking water program, but the drinking water SRF is what funds our drinking water systems, which is very important. But we're really looking at the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which more broadly funds wastewater systems, stormwater systems, and then all the non-point source practices that we really want to see an increase in. They are managed at the state level. So in Illinois, we have the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. I always encourage people to contact your state agency if you have questions and start talking. We're talking to state agencies as well, but they want to hear from you. And it's important they hear from people who have interest in their program. So here's sort of a schematic of what everybody generally thinks of when they think about state revolving funds. Typically, these funds are going to these large-scale drinking and wastewater treatment systems. But if we think about what they could fund, we also get to nature-based solutions. So again, there's got to be a tie to water quality. You can have all the other co-benefits prioritized, but as long as there's that tie to water quality, it becomes eligible. So in terms of what's possible, all of the nature-based solutions that we're thinking about, both larger scale, natural infrastructure, all the way to smaller scale, like a rain garden. And then showing this a different way for those who are better visual with in more of a table format here. So again, we've got that water quality benefit, traditional projects. So most of the funding is going to what we would consider traditional projects, typically addressing point source pollution and water management. So we've got our wastewater systems upgrades and expansions. Then we have on the other side here our non-traditional projects, which we're not seeing as much, but they are eligible. So if you're familiar with 319, our non-point source watershed programs, every state also has via the Clean Water Act. SRF can fund anything on the ground 319. We've got something similar, but focused on protecting estuaries, so the National Estuary Program, decentralized wastewater treatment, so septics, which are very important in a lot of watersheds, stormwater, both the gray and the green. Some states are more advanced in terms of having a lot of stormwater applications. Some states are still it's still a little bit newer. And then watershed pilot projects. So states can, figure out like what is the priority in the state to address water quality, and they can have pilot projects or set aside programs. I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second, but they can figure out how to address it, and it's really wide open for the states to do that. The other piece here that I think is important for people to know about when it comes to state revolving funds is the Green Project Reserve. And so this is a federal requirement that 10% of the yearly allocation that states receive through the EPA, 10% of that has to go to practices that qualify under Green Project Reserve, kind of similar to the way it sounds. We're getting into more innovative, kind of the non-traditional route. So there's kind of 4 buckets in here, I like to call them. We've got green infrastructure, which for our purposes, this is what we're most concerned about in terms of conservation, watershed, and non-point source practices. There's also water efficiency, energy efficiency, and then environmentally innovative activities. So we're not really seeing a whole lot of Green Project Reserve practices that fall within green infrastructure. Most states are really meeting this 10% requirement via water and energy efficiency. So having that be available isn't really enough to, or having that requirement and having that be available isn't really enough to see that rise in the green infrastructure practices from what we've seen so far. Something else at the bottom here that I really like to make sure people are aware of. So when it comes again to what's allowable versus what states are doing. So when it comes to the subsidy, that forgivable allocation that states are providing to their borrowers, a lot of states are providing that subsidy based on affordability or median household income. States are allowed via what the federal government says to put their subsidy towards green project reserve. So this is definitely a route if states want to try to see more green infrastructure, nature-based solution projects, they could think about adjusting their subsidy to also include that green project reserve component. So talking a little bit more specifically about Illinois, so some of the main things to think about in these programs, because I know there's a lot. Here's a few of those kind of main bullet points that we want to look at when we're starting to look at what a state, how a state manages their program and what they allow. So in terms of eligible borrowers, Illinois does allow pretty much all federal eligibilities, which is nice because some states really only allow like other government entities. But from what we've seen so far, there actually hasn't been a history of private borrowers, even though technically it's allowed. And there's reasons for that too, which hopefully will become clear here. Additional subsidy. So what Illinois does is if 50% or more of the project funds are going to a green project reserve project, then you get a 0.2% discount, which is kind of a nice little discount there. But currently, Illinois doesn't have any other kind of pilot or set aside projects for not nature-based solution, non-point source funding. And then there's also not really an incentive ranking wise. Some states have additional ranking points you get if you have a green or non-point source project. But clarifying, this is set in policy, not stone, and there really is the ability to work towards changing this and meeting everybody's goals for the program. So we know now that the possibility of nature-based solutions within state revolving funds is there. We could do it. The federal government says we can, but the reality really has been that we're not seeing a lot of these projects be applied for or especially funded. And so we see about 4% of funds since these programs were started in the late 80s. Only about 4% of the funds have gone towards non-point source projects. Looking at Illinois, this is hopefully you can see this okay, but I'll speak to it. So from 2016 to 2020, Illinois had, it looks like about 1% spent on green infrastructure and specifically on habitat restoration, which I think based on what I've looked at has to do with like stormwater wetlands. So kind of where our reality is at, it looks a little bleak, right? But we're also seeing these really common barriers across, all the states that we talk to, and based on what we're seeing, there's really this common thread of, each state having autonomy to manage their own state program has sort of resulted in that minimization, or maybe kind of by accident putting up barriers to non-point source projects because they are so very infrastructure focused. We see this, perceived lack of demand for these projects to be funded through the SRF. Ultimately, capacity to manage projects. I think everybody, capacity is just a huge topic right now across the board. But capacity to manage these projects, lack of understanding. So, believe it or not, the divisions within or the divisions, I never know the words people use exactly for their state agency, but the divisions within these state agencies, like, believe it or not, they're not really talking to each other all the time, right? So you've got your non-point source section and you've got your infrastructure branch or your SRF management area, and they don't always talk to each other. So like imagine if they, I don't know, walk down the hall or set up a meeting and started talking about priorities and where you can really leverage expertise right within your own agency to think about what the value of nature-based solutions are and standards for if you're going to implement it and all of those pieces, which really just lends to this really wide scale disconnect that, I can experience personally. And I see constantly in these situations, and when talking to people, disconnect between, the way we manage point sources and our non-point source work. I alluded to the fact that there are more innovative programs that states can decide to create for nature-based solutions, non-point source work. Here is a map of some of those. I believe this is current, but maybe since March 2021, others have been created, and we'll have to add to that. But in general, as far as we know, Illinois doesn't have any additional programs or incentives for nature-based solutions. Three of these main examples, which if you've dug into this, maybe you've heard of, would be a sponsorship program. That's an example which basically creates a grant program for nature-based solution practices based on incentive or reduced interest rate incentives that borrowers get. There's pass-through, there's link deposits, and those make it easier to get funding to private property owners. Septic is a really big one there. We know in a lot of watersheds, septic is a big driver in having not meeting water quality standards, maybe compared to our gray infrastructure. So for green projects to rank high enough, this is sort of where we're at now. So for green projects to rank high enough to receive funding, as is, we really need to think about connecting with a gray project. And in Illinois, projects addressing compliance and violations are really going to be those that receive the most points. So kind of saying that again here, what's realistic now? Again, we know what's possible. We're trying to get to possible, but we need to start with where we're at today. So if we want to sort of stress test this, thinking about what we have to do over the next year, we really want to think about what our projects are and what communities or utilities in our communities are applying to state revolving funds, and looking at matching the two of those, kind of integrating that green and gray approach. So every state has an intended use plan. It comes out every year. It talks about the goals of each state, as well as their process for how they distribute their money and their priority list of applications, and kind of who is getting ranked highest and getting funded. So that's a document that I'd encourage people to look at if you want to really dig into what Illinois is doing. Again, the intended use plan, and you'll find that on the Illinois EPA website. But there are a few examples that we have to just kind of ground this a little bit in what we could do. And so, of course, these aren't Illinois, but there are states that have really utilized SRF or combined it with other funding programs to have a water quality benefit for via nature-based solution projects. So green infrastructure is, again, really kind of one of the more common practices that we see via state revolving funds. But we also see things like protecting aquifers and recharge zones, getting into source water protection. In terms of the urban work, I think Camden County, New Jersey is probably the most comprehensive location I've seen, where they're really having implementation of nature-based solutions wide scale across their city, and doing a good job to bring in that workforce development piece, thinking about long-term sustainability after these projects are planted. A couple more here, which I think might tie more directly to your priorities, thinking about, again, those larger practices, so shoreline restoration, natural infrastructure. This is up in northern Minnesota, the top of the Mississippi River, which is really exciting to see. But it's one of those sites where if there weren't signs, I probably wouldn't have known this was like purposely planted as a living shoreline. It was just really awesome to see. And they did have signage, which is really important, and even said, we saved $400,000 by switching to natural plantings instead of hard armoring along this lake shoreline. So that cost piece is super important. This other one here, which I wanted to make sure I mentioned to you all, because we're actively kind of digging into where this could be a possibility. If you have ideas, let us know, because it could be a really good opportunity to prove this out and be supportive of this work. The source water protection via constructed wetlands, again, another natural infrastructure, larger scale practice. We're really seeking to identify drinking water utilities that could benefit from, instead of upgrading their gray infrastructure facility? What if we actually just reduce the nutrients before it got to the drinking water intake with constructed wetlands? Okay, so my last section here is making your case, giving you a bit more justification to think about, digging more into this and seeing it as a possibility to really start looking at. So it starts with a plan, right? So where, understanding, if we back up, we've got, these are all the projects that state revolving funds fund. How did they get there? So I'm a very process oriented person. I want to go back in time and see, well, how did we get to this point, right? So we can understand how we can change it and how we can add in our priorities, which would be nature-based solutions. So in terms of this, I think this is just a really important concept for everybody to understand, whether it's state revolving funds or not, is just this local planning and how much local planning and local decision making really influences what happens to our land. And I'm sure a lot of you are also very familiar with this. But capital plans are really what drive local budgets, and they're the primary focus of our decision makers and our local elected officials. And state revolving funds, those projects mostly stem from capital plans. So we've got capital plans on one side, and then on the other side, we've got all our other plans and priorities, and mostly they don't talk. And when I've seen this start to get done well, they start talking. And so this is a key thing to understand. So we've got our hazard mitigation plan, we've got watershed plans, or even our comprehensive plans, sustainability plans, if you've gotten that far, or your plans, whatever your plans look like, thinking about how you're going to protect land, obtain easements, and all the important pieces that drive your work, right? So in terms of justifying the case for nature-based solutions, we got to kind of gear it towards what local decision makers are going to get incentive from, are going to have benefits from. And there's a lot of reasons why local decision makers would want to think about nature-based solutions. We just need people like yourselves to start talking to them. So one of those pieces is directly related to state revolving funds. So in some places, you're going to have, at least in Illinois, have more subsidy if you include a green project reserve project. It'd be nice if that was a green infrastructure project beyond just the water and energy efficiency. Illinois right now doesn't have additional points for application if you have a green project, but that could change, and that's something to keep an eye on and even talk to your state about. Meeting your permits and consent decrees, very much an incentive to think about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, especially because consent decrees from EPA require green infrastructure. So if you've got that near the area you want to do work, that's a really important connection to make. Addressing failing infrastructure. We're all thinking about failing infrastructure right now, especially our decision makers, and they're really focused on gray. So what if we could connect that to the green and still meet those needs? Resiliency and disaster recovery. A lot more places are experiencing disaster, be it flooding or tornadoes or wildfires, or even issues of extreme heat. Now is a good time to start talking about nature-based solutions. Workforce expansion, jobs, that's a big priority, right? And then ultimately tying into all this is that cost savings. And that's something that we're trying to find examples of, we're trying to prove out, because I think it really needs to be proved out on a local level. We know it's possible, and we know it's the answer, but that's not enough to really drive that switch. Conservation groups, yourself, you're so important to this work, having those conversations. You're aware of where the need is on the ground for the environment. You understand project development of nature-based solutions. You're able to provide that education, and then also helping with long-term project success. So mentioning that kind of workforce expansion capacity, as we know, we really need a whole shift in our workforce, and having a lot more people that know how to build and design and manage green infrastructure and these nature-based solution practices. But currently we really rely on volunteers. So having that success, we need that knowledge transfer. We need those volunteers to be part of that. And we need that knowledge transfer to those who are going to be maintaining these projects long-term. Okay, so general steps to getting started, kind of grounding this, and okay, what do I do now, right? thinking about who are the key players in state revolving funds. So your local drinking water, your wastewater, the utilities, connecting with local decision makers at the state level, your infrastructure branch, your non-point source branch. Maybe you could be the catalyst that connects those two people together, as well as the stormwater work, because that's going to be really important as well. Key concepts, so understanding in your state, what are the key concepts for state revolving funds? Who are the eligible borrowers? Kind of how do the loans work? Where's free money going? How does ranking work? What is the timeline? We talked about some of these. We didn't talk too much about the timeline, but in general, the timeline in Illinois is in March. And then understanding again those local priorities. What are the benefits or co-benefits that your community is really seeking that can tie to nature-based solutions? Where's your city or municipality at with their capital plan? And just a lot of areas needed for support. This isn't a comprehensive list, but we know we need more education, that integration of local planning, identifying our projects via SRF, or really all the funding, getting to the point of being clear on what our needs and our projects are is really critical right now. Understanding our funding options, the ability to stack funding. Maybe you're getting some funding through a grant, maybe some through SRF, maybe some through a local allocation from the budget. There's a lot of ways we can think about how to move money together to really get a comprehensive project. Bringing in the contractors who know how to do this work. And then again, I mentioned that O&M, operation and maintenance, and workforce capacity piece. So at the top here, we see, people working together, having conversations. We know this is a process that kind of gets to those wins. And then we also know that a lot of us are in those situations or have been in those situations where it just feels like the doors, maybe we can't even find the door. We're not let in. Nobody, these people, I haven't really seen, unfortunately, them calling the people like us who really get this work and understand nature-based solutions. But that's okay. We can go to them and we can try to enter those rooms and have those conversations, which leads to, the clarity that we are really on the forefront of this. You're the only one talking about it. That's okay. That's to be expected. Keep talking, keep having these conversations. Again, if it's SRF or really any of this other work, how do we start to integrate nature-based solutions into local level planning and decision making and having that holistic change that we do really need in the future? Being aware that there's a lot of funding sources out there, and there's a lot of databases now that will show you where to find funding. So SRFs are really the long game, but in the meantime, there's a lot of other funds available, and this is just one that I think people should be aware of. There, again, are a few. National Wildlife Federation has this funding database, and they do a good job of bringing in all those opportunities in one space, because it is a lot to find. And just a reminder that, these conversations, we hope to keep having them. We hope to keep diving in with you and helping people and figuring out where help is needed and where we can provide that capacity around funding for nature-based solutions. And I think I went a little longer than I meant to, but hopefully we still got enough time for questions, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becca. Are there any questions right off the bat? I think my brain is just absorbing, and I'm, of course, if there aren't, I can lead with one. But if anybody has a question, you can put it in the chat, or we're a nice small group of 20, so feel free to just raise your hand.
So this is Maggie Solas. I'm with Cane DuPage Soil and Water Conservation District and the State Association. My big question is, are there funds for updating those existing watershed plans? I know we can go through the 319 process with the IEPA, but it would be, my opinion is it would be wonderful to be able to go in and so many of them are out of date right now. And that's where we can find our projects to get them on the ground, but because they're out of date. Is there money for that?
Do you mean money for monitoring, or money just for kind of expanding your list of watershed plan solutions?
The money for actually looking at the watershed plans and writing them or updating them.
Beyond 319, I don't know. I do know, at least from my experience as a watershed coordinator, if you've got people who are like the stakeholders, if you can get them together, I mean, you can do the update in-house and send it to your state agency for approval. And the only money that requires is having kind of a central person to lead that. So if you already have that central person, great. If you don't, then I think somebody kind of needs to step up and start to do that stakeholder building and having those conversations. But I don't know if you necessarily need direct funds for that, depending on, I don't know exactly how Illinois works, but a lot of it could really just be getting the right people in the room to start looking at what you have and saying, what do we need to add to this? What's changed since then?
I think that is one of the concerns here in Illinois is it's been taking so long to get the funds from the IEPA to get these watershed plans updated and or written for the first time. And there are some people, Fox River Ecosystem Partnership, certainly, and the Conservation Foundation certainly have been focusing on that, but we seem to get in a bottleneck when it gets to Springfield as to getting the funding. And that's why I was wondering if there's a way to get more funding for that more quickly.
Yeah, I'll pass over to Sean. I saw you unmuted, but I should clarify too that you're if you're applying for state revolving funds, you don't have to have a watershed plan necessarily. Like you don't have to have. I know if you're going to 319 funds, you've got to have that watershed plan. You don't have to have that watershed plan if you're going to state revolving funds. It obviously is just helpful. And Sean, I'll pass it to you if you had something to add.
Yeah, there isn't like a really clear fit for the watershed plans with the SRF program, but we are seeing a number of new funding sources, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NOAA also supporting quite a bit more on the planning side, which for watershed plans, ecosystem restoration plans, that I could see overlaying really nicely with a lot of the work of the folks who are on this call. So if that's a particular interest and would help identify those projects, we'd love to have a follow-up and work directly with you to see if we can identify some of those like new opportunities that are coming down and seeing if that could be a funding source.
Thank you.
And Sean and Becca, if you can check the chat, there's a great question in there from Rebecca. I won't read it aloud. If you want to just look at that and then respond.
Oh, the potential. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, let's do some math here. So I want to say just under 12 billion, if this graphic is correct. Let me see if I can paste it here. And Sean, if you've got other thoughts, let me know. So yes, 44 billion total if we're just looking at CWSRF minus emerging contaminants.
Yeah, it looks about it's about 2 billion a year across the 50 states for just the clean water side, about 1.7 billion a year for the bill part of the clean water SRF program. To go like one level deeper, and one of the major challenges, and many of you have already started to see it, is the community or congressionally delegated spending. You know, the old earmarks have made their way back to Congress. And the funding source for those, you'll sometimes see it as CDS, are pulled out of the funding source for the SRF. And that was actually a real big surprise to many of the congressional staffers who were talking about increased money for earmarks for water infrastructure projects, but it was actually just being pulled out of the future allocations of SRF. So those go hand in hand, and has actually lowered the future allocations to many of the states to go to water infrastructure projects through SRF. And this is a major talking point right now through a lot of the states of how they're going to actually, they were planning for more money and they're actually getting less. And then your second part of your question, Rebecca, about O&M. O&M is not a eligible cost or expense through the SRF, unfortunately. This is an issue that needs to be addressed. We've talked about it everywhere, that not only on the SRF and financing side, but just grants in general. It's oftentimes like cut the ribbon and then say good luck. And we need to think about the overall project arc of performance over time. If we talk about, having green infrastructure systems that work for communities, they also need to be maintained. But everyone always focuses on the gray infrastructure, and there's a challenge with how we maintain that as well. But I think this is absolutely a critical issue that needs to be addressed at the federal level of what is eligible for federal dollars, and O&M as well as pre-development need to be included. So it's a really important question.
And to add to that too, this was kind of, I should have mentioned this earlier, but definitely glad this question about O&M was asked. So it doesn't fund O&M, but O&M doesn't start once the project is done being installed. You have that buffer time where you're like plants are establishing, right? You plant a tree, you need to check on it, make sure it's watered, all the things that lead it to be healthy and on its own be able to grow without anybody interfering, right? So you have the option to have establishment costs for your project, which you can have 3 years. So when you're submitting your project, making sure to consider what do you need at least in the first 3 years of managing your project to get it to be established. And then from there, you'd have to think about long-term O&M. And I know before the call, we were talking about, the same type of issue. Climate Corps just came out recently through the Biden administration. There's a lot of talk all around. We just need to, nobody's alone in this. This is a huge kind of sweeping systemic change we need across all communities to figure this piece out.
And Viv has a question about the cost associated with planning and implementation, and if that's part of this and associated with it, or what other funding could be paired with State Revolving Fund and nature-based solutions projects.
Yeah, so there are a lot of funds for planning right now, grants. Not through, at least in Illinois, through the State Revolving Fund. Some states do have kind of pre-construction planning loans. Illinois, last time I checked, does not. But there are other ways you could sort of stack funds. And then if a lot of this is having sort of that point person, be it a watershed coordinator, conservationist, somebody who can support all of this is really essential. And I bring up the watershed coordinator having that tie to 319. 319 are obviously really essential funds and also kind of the main funds we have for watershed coordinators, as I've seen. So if those funds could focus on the actual human capacity, now you have somebody who can provide that support to go after other funds for the implementation. So really kind of breaking these silos and thinking about the way we are looking at all of this in our community. And I'm sure there's a lot more options. And I think we're sort of at the beginning of trying to figure out how these puzzle pieces fit together. And if anybody has any other thoughts, please jump in.
Yeah, and to dovetail with that, Viv, project management and administration is a part of the overall eligible cost structure for these projects. And that's, part of the opportunity that we see of assisting communities is how do we make these programs more efficient? So yeah, that is an eligible cost.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I want to thank everyone for being on today, and I want to thank Viv Bennett also because she connected me with Sean and Becca over the summer. So I really appreciate that and appreciate your time here today. And we look forward to staying in touch because I know we're at the beginning of talking about this and the possibility of partnerships between our conservation land trusts and municipalities and just kind of creative thinking. I know a lot of those on the call are very creative thinkers about partnership and how to move things along. And especially with nature-based solutions, we need a division of nature-based solutions, right? Speaking of divisions. So, it's exciting because it's new, but it's kind of daunting because it's new. And I guess just to close things up, I'm just very curious in other areas of the country, do you have an example of like a conservation land trust organization that's partnering or that has received funds or working on projects? And then we'll close. And if people have to drop off, understandable.
Sean, I'll let you take that. I think you've got some good examples.
Sure. Yeah, there's a bunch. We'll be happy to send around some examples afterwards. One that is of particular interest maybe to this group is in Vermont, the Trust for Public Land worked with a small community on protecting a town forest. And what there was opportunity of accessing a piece of land that was coming up for sale. And a lot of times it's hard to assemble the money right away to purchase something while you have the opportunity to buy it. And so the state revolving fund actually stepped in and worked with the Trust for Public Land to provide bridge loan financing, about a 5-year term with a balloon at the end, which means that it would actually escalate if you weren't able to pay it back, but super, super low interest. To be able to acquire that piece of property that would then become this town forest in Huntington, Vermont. And what that allowed to do is that then at the end of the day, philanthropic dollars were able to come in, and other donations and other sources of grant capital were able to come into the Trust Public Land, and they were actually able to pay back the SRF loan in pretty short order within a couple of years. So the SRF really became the tool to provide access to that capital really quickly. So that's one example of a land and conservation organization utilizing the SRF.
That's a great example. Thank you. Oh, someone's just arriving. Oops. Thanks so much. And thanks again, everyone. And again, this is being recorded.